Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Charlotte here with a video using Skull and Cross Buns products, and I'm going to be making a tropical themed card today. I'm using the little freebie stencil from last month with the fruit, the large Mermaid stencil, the tropical party stamp sets, some inks from Simon Says Stamp, and I will also be using my texture paste. I did also later bring in a sentiment from the Quirky sentiment stamp set, but I did not show that because I hadn't known at the start that I would be using it. To begin the card, I will be doing some stenciling with my texture paste and the large Mermaid stencil. My texture paste seems to have really dried up. I'm not quite sure why it's dried up so much. It was stored, I thought, properly with the lid screwed on tightly and the protective paper in place, but maybe I should have been storing it a bit differently. If you have any suggestions of how best to store texture paste, I would love it if you could let me know in the comments below, because if I replace this one I want to make sure that I can store the new one properly. So as mine was so dried up and difficult to work with, I ended up trying to revive it by spritzing it with some water. This water just happens to have perfect pearls in it just because that was the closest one I had to hand. I don't think it made any difference to the appearance of the texture paste, so if you're trying to recreate my card you really do not need to use perfect pearls on it, I don't think. So once I had a more malleable consistency, I'm going to use my palette knife to apply it to the stencil. I think actually I should have kept working it a little bit longer before applying it because it was still a bit difficult to work with and there were some lumps that were quite tricky to spread. But I kept spreading it out with my palette knife until I had a nice smooth surface all across the stenciled area of the card. It's quite a thick layer as well because I had trouble when I tried to kind of scrape it back to make it thinner. It was just coming off completely, so I just left it thick. So once I was happy with it, I peeled up the stencil and I'm going to use my palette knife just to clean up the edges and also the little bit that went above the top of the stencil. That probably wasn't really necessary as my sentiment strip will end up covering that area anyway. I then took the stencil and the palette knife to the sink and washed off what was left of the texture paste so that it wouldn't dry and be impossible to remove. I then moved on to stenciling the top part of my card, and I'm using the citrus fruit element from the freebie stencil. I wanted to do an orange, a lemon and a lime repeating in a pattern across the card. So I have lemon zest, orange slash and key lime inks from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm just working my way across the card, stenciling those in. I'm using just some makeup brushes to sponge the colour on, and each time I will move the stencil to a new place and swap colour, because that way I can make sure there are no places where there are two colours the same next to each other. Initially I'd only masked off the other two fruit pieces, but I did end up adding a mask to the bottom portion as well to stop any ink going where I didn't want it. I like to apply Tombow Mono Multi liquid glue to the back of my stencils because that way when it's dried the stencil is repositionable, so I can just press it into place and it will hold in place where I want it. Which means I can easily sponge through it without it moving on me, which I just find makes it a lot easier to do the stenciling. I did have a bit of a smudge before I'd added that extra piece of masking tape on, so I went in and removed that with my sand eraser. Then when I got towards the bottom of the card where the texture paste is, as the paste wasn't fully dry, I just kind of bent the stencil up carefully so that it wouldn't be pressing on the texture paste, and that way I could still get those areas stenciled. So I set my finished card base aside to dry and started working on the other elements I needed, and these are from the Tropical Party stamp set. I stamped out 2 of the parrots onto just a snippet of white cardstock. This is alcohol marker friendly, and I'm also going to stamp 3 feathers. And I'm using MFT Black Licorice Hybrid ink because it is alcohol marker friendly. And here you can see the colours I will be using for colouring my images. And if you don't want to watch me doing all the colouring, you can skip to the time shown on screen. That way you can skip all the colouring and just move on to the assembly of the card. So you can see all the caps on screen. I'm using Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers. And I started by colouring the beak and the feet of the parrot, of both parrots. I will colour them both at once, although I end up only using one of them. I have kept the other one in my stamp, in with the stamp set, and I will use it on a future card. I chose oranges for the parrot's wings and green for the tail feathers. And I'm trying to pick my colours to coordinate with the colours I used on the background because I wanted it all to go nicely together. I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to do the body of the parrot, so I started just adding in my colours around the eyes. I used my darkest green and darkest orange for those areas. And then I decided I would do a kind of gradient effect on the parrot's body, so going from green towards where the tail is, and then moving up to orange at the head. And I just brought in some of my yellows that I had used for the beak and feet to be my transition colour, because if you try to go directly from the green to the orange, it will just make a very muddy colour, but having the yellow as a transition helps them blend together more nicely. And once I had completed my parrots, I moved on to the feathers. And as I have 3 feathers and 3 main colours on my card, I did 1 feather in each colour. So I am starting with my orange feather, and I put my darkest colour just along the central area of the feather. Then my next darkest on the outer edge, and bringing that shadow area out, and then the lightest colour to just fill in the whole rest of the feather. And I will do the exact same technique for my other feathers, so the green one and the yellow one. And I actually ended up being not so neat colouring them in because I'm going to be fussy cutting them out anyway, so it doesn't matter if I go over the lines a bit. And for my yellow, I actually use a golden yellow, which is kind of almost orangey in tone, to be my darkest colour because I just find that gives a bit of better contrast. Then I'm going to fussy cut out each of my elements, so all 3 of the feathers and the parrot that I'm using. And as I said, the other parrot I will slip into the back of my stamp pocket to use on a future card. I decided I wanted the centre portion of the feather, I'm not sure what you'll call that. I wanted it to be a bit paler on each of them, so I'm using my white gel pen just to bring the colour back a bit. And then I'm going to go around each of my fussy cut elements with a water-based brush tip marker. Normally I use a black one for this, but I realised partway through that I had picked up grey. It works well enough, so it didn't really matter, but just colouring in the white edge where it has been fussy cut just helps it look a bit tidier. Next I'm going to be creating my sentiment, and here is where I decided to bring in the Quirky sentiment stamp set. There is a hello in the tropical party set, but it's quite small and I decided I would rather use the larger one from Quirky Sentiments. So I'm using my MISTI to get that lined up on a snippet of black card. I'm treating it well with my anti-static powder tool, inking it up with embossing ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss it with some white embossing powder, and I believe this is a fine detail embossing powder. I like to make sure my heat gun is good and hot before I start heating, just to make sure I don't warp the paper too much. I then used my craft knife and a metal ruler to trim down the sentiment panel, and I will rub away the leftover powder using just my finger. I decided to add some stitching lines along the top and bottom of the sentiment strip, so I'm just using my white gel pen to add those lines. And I think this may well be the first time I've ever added stitch lines myself with a gel pen. I worked out how I wanted everything laid out, and I decided it would be easiest to adhere the feathers together so that they are one element before adding them to the card base. So I'm using Tombow Monomulti liquid glue and my reverse tweezers just to help me get those into place. Once they're all stuck together, I'll use some more of the Tombow glue and adhere them onto the lower portion of the card base, so they will be hanging out from the bottom of my sentiment strip. And I just put an acrylic block on top of them to weigh them down a bit, just to help them hold on to the textured background. Then I will adhere the parrot to the top of the sentiment strip to look as if it's sitting on top of the strip, and again I used my Tombow glue for that, and I lined the strip up on the card base just to make sure I got the parrot in the right place. I want to pop up the sentiment strip, so I'm going to use some foam squares, and these are black foam squares. I do have white foam squares and white foam tape as well, but when I have a black element I like to use the black foam squares behind it. I just think it looks neater. So I will then press that into place on my card base. And as a final touch, I wanted to add some shimmer. I have two shimmer pens, the Wink of Stella and the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer. The Wink of Stella is more gold in tone, whereas the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer has more kind of silveriness to it, even though they are both clear shimmer pens. So I do have both, and I use the Nuvo one more, but I do still use the Wink of Stella one for some things. So that completes my Tropical Hello card featuring two kinds of stenciling with Skull and Cross Buns, stamps and stencils. I hope you enjoyed the video, and you can find all the products used down in the description box below, as well as over on my blog, which there is also a link down below to that, and there are other pictures there too. You can use the code on screen to save 10% on your order at Skull and Cross Buns, so definitely worth checking that out. Thank you so much for watching. There are a couple of other videos on screen that you may enjoy, and you can also press the subscribe button to subscribe, and if you press the bell down below you will make sure you are notified every time I post a new video so that you won't miss any. Happy crafting, and I will see you next time. Bye!